7 bullets had torn through his body. His comrades had left him behind, not out of cruelty, but because no one survives wounds like that. The stretcher bearers walked right past him. The newspapers back home had already printed his death notice, but somewhere in the mud of France, on the bloodiest battlefield Australian soldiers had ever known, a man refused to die. He had just done something no one thought possible, charging 150 Germans with only 7 men at his side, freeing 40 prisoners in a fight so brutal it was called the most dramatic act of individual audacity in the history of the Australian Army. And yet, when the fighting stopped, he was forgotten, left for dead. What happened next? How he crawled back from the edge of the grave would turn him into a legend. But here's what the official records never told you. The man who earned Australia's first Victoria Cross may have deserved 3. And the reason he didn't get them? That's a story of courage, politics, and a truth that was buried for a century. Before we begin, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from today. I love seeing how far this community stretches across the world. And if you haven't yet, subscribe now. Because stories like this one, the hidden truths of the Great War, are exactly what this channel was made for. Now, let's go back to Gallipoli, 1915, where a quiet timber worker from rural Victoria was about to become immortal. In the timber country of Victoria, where the eucalyptus forests stretched toward horizons that seemed to promise nothing but ordinary lives, a young man named Albert Jacka was learning the quiet work of the land. He was 21 years old in the spring of 1914, employed by the State Forest Department, spending his days cutting and planting trees, maintaining fire breaks, travelling the dusty roads between small towns with names that meant nothing to the wider world: Wedderburn, Kahuna, Kundruk, Lake Charm. There was nothing remarkable about him, nothing that would suggest what he would become. He was the 4th of 7 children, born on a dairy farm near Winchelsea in 1893. His father, Nathaniel, had worked as a timber hauler, supplying sleepers to the Victorian railways and props to the mines around Bendigo. His mother, Elizabeth, was English-born. The family moved to Wedderburn when Albert was 5, and it was there in the goldfields country of central Victoria that he grew up. He finished school at 13. There was no secondary school nearby, and the cost of boarding in a larger town was beyond the family's means. So Albert did what countless young men of his generation did. He went to work. He helped his father with the hauling business. He learned to handle horses, to manage loads, to do the hard physical labor that built the country's infrastructure one sleeper, one fence post, one delivery at a time. By 18, he had joined the Forest Department. It was steady work, respectable, the kind of job a man could hold for a lifetime. And then, in August 1914, the world changed. When war broke out between Britain and Germany, Australia, as a dominion of the British Empire, was automatically at war as well. Within weeks, young men across the country were lining up at recruitment centres, eager to serve king and empire, eager for adventure, eager to prove themselves on the world stage. Albert Jacka enlisted on 18th September 1914 at Heathcote. He was assigned to the 14th Battalion of the Australian Imperial Force and sent to Broadmeadows training camp outside Melbourne. If you asked him why he joined, he would not have given you a stirring speech about patriotism or duty. Jacka was not a man of words. He was quiet, shy even. His mates would later describe him as reserved, slow to speak, uncomfortable with attention. But there was something else beneath that quiet exterior, a stubborn determination, a refusal to back down, a quality that would only reveal itself under pressure. At Broadmeadows, while other soldiers relaxed in the evenings, Jacka attended officer training classes. He was not content to remain a private. He studied, he watched. He earned a reputation not as a talker, but as a doer. And he was promoted to acting lance corporal before the battalion even left Australian shores. There was one other thing his mates noticed about him. In the boxing ring, Albert Jacka was not easily provoked. He was patient, calculating, slow to anger. But once his blood was up, once the fight truly began, he became a different man entirely, fierce, uncompromising, relentless. It was a quality that would serve him well in the months to come. On 22nd December 1914, just days before Christmas, the 14th Battalion embarked aboard HMAT Ulysses, bound for Egypt. They sailed into the unknown, young men who had never left Australia, who had never seen combat, who had no idea what awaited them on the other side of the world. They trained in the shadow of the pyramids for 2 months. They learned to use their rifles. They practiced bayonet drills. They sweated under the desert sun and complained about the sand and the heat and the endless waiting. And then, in April 1915, the orders came. The Allies had conceived a bold plan to knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war. A naval force would sail through the Dardanelles, the narrow strait connecting the Mediterranean to the Black Sea. They would seize Constantinople, open a supply route to Russia, and change the course of the war. But the naval attack failed. The straits were mined, 3 battleships were sunk, and so the decision was made to land ground forces on the Gallipoli Peninsula to capture the forts from behind and force the passage by land. The men of the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, the ANZACs, would be among those leading the assault. On 26 April 1915, one day after the initial landings, the 14th Battalion came ashore at ANZAC Cove. Albert Jacka stepped onto the narrow beach beneath the towering cliffs. The sound of rifle fire echoed from the ridges above. The wounded were already being carried back to the boats. The dead lay where they had fallen. He was 22 years old. He had never killed a man. He had never faced death. Within 3 weeks, he would become a legend. The trenches at Gallipoli were unlike anything the Australians had imagined. They had trained for open warfare, for sweeping advances across enemy territory. What they found instead was a nightmare of confined spaces, where the Turkish lines lay so close that a man could hear his enemy coughing, praying, talking in the darkness. At Courtney's Post, named after Lieutenant Colonel Richard Courtney, commander of the 14th Battalion, the distance between the Australian and Turkish trenches was measured in metres, not hundreds of yards. In some places, the opposing lines were separated by less than 15 paces. A soldier lighting a cigarette at night might as well be painting a target on his chest. The position sat on the cliffs above ANZAC Cove, part of a precarious line that the Australians had carved into the steep hillsides after the landing. Every day brought sniper fire. Every night brought the tension of waiting for an attack that might come at any moment. Sleep was stolen in fragments. Food was eaten cold in the darkness. The stench of death hung over everything, inescapable and suffocating. Albert Jacka settled into this world with the same quiet determination he had shown in training. He did not complain. He did not boast. He simply did his job day after day, watching the Turkish lines, waiting. In early May, intelligence reports began filtering down to the frontline troops. The Turkish commanders were planning something, a massive assault, an attempt to drive the Anzacs back into the sea once and for all. The attack came just before dawn on 19th May 1915. Across the entire Anzac front, Turkish soldiers poured out of their trenches in wave after wave. The assault was enormous. Tens of thousands of men, ordered to overwhelm the Australian and New Zealand positions through sheer weight of numbers. The sound was deafening. The crack of rifles, the deeper boom of machine guns, the screams of the wounded and the dying. At most points along the line, the Australians held. The Turkish soldiers, advancing across open ground against entrenched defenders, were cut down in terrible numbers. By the end of the day, the slopes before the Anzac trenches would be covered with bodies, so many that a truce would later be called simply to bury the dead. But at Courtney's Post, something went wrong. In the chaos of the pre-dawn assault, a group of Turkish soldiers broke through. They overran a section of the Australian trench, killing or wounding the defenders, and established themselves in a position that threatened the entire line. If they could hold it, if they could be reinforced, the breakthrough might become a collapse. Albert Jacka was in the next section of trench, separated from the Turkish incursion by a firing bay, a zigzag corner designed to limit the damage from grenades and enfilade fire. He could hear the fighting. He could hear the shouts in Turkish, the cries of his wounded mates. 4 of the 5 men with him were already dead or wounded. He was effectively alone, but he did not retreat. Instead, Jacka pressed himself into the firing bay and began shooting into the trench wall, not to kill, but to delay. Every bullet he fired forced the Turkish soldiers to take cover, slowing their advance, buying precious seconds for reinforcements to arrive. When other Australians finally reached the position, a counterattack was hastily organised. Lieutenant William Hamilton led the first attempt, jumping into the trench with his revolver blazing. He was shot through the head almost immediately. A second officer, Lieutenant Keith Crabb, arrived and asked Jacka if he would charge the Turkish position. Jacka said he would, if he had support. 3 volunteers stepped forward, Privates Howard, Pollines, and Diarango. Together, the 4 men rushed around the corner of the trench. All 3 volunteers were hit within seconds. Jacka was forced to fall back, but he was not finished. While the others kept the Turks occupied with rifle fire and grenades thrown from the front, Jacka did something that required either extraordinary courage or complete disregard for his own survival. He climbed out of the trench, crossed over the top in full view of any enemy who might be watching, and dropped into the Turkish-held section from behind. He landed among 7 Turkish soldiers. What followed lasted only seconds, but it would be remembered for more than a century. Jacka shot 5 of the Turks with his rifle. The remaining 2 came at him with bayonets. He killed them both in hand-to-hand combat. The survivors fled. The position was retaken. Jacka held the trench alone for the rest of the night, waiting for reinforcements that did not come until dawn. When his platoon commander finally found him the next morning, surrounded by the bodies of the men he had killed, Jacka offered only a modest summary of what had happened. "Well, I managed to get the beggars, sir." For this action, Lance Corporal Albert Jacka was awarded the Victoria Cross, Australia's first of the Great War. He was 22 years old, and he had just become the most famous soldier in the country. But Gallipoli was only the beginning. The real test was still to come. The Gallipoli campaign ended not with victory, but with evacuation. By December 1915, the Allied commanders had accepted what the soldiers in the trenches had known for months. There would be no breakthrough. The Turks could not be dislodged. The cliffs above Anzac Cove would remain in Ottoman hands. In the final weeks of the campaign, the Australians and New Zealanders were withdrawn from the peninsula in a masterful operation that succeeded where the landings had failed. The beaches were emptied silently, under cover of darkness. Without the Turks realizing, until it was too late, it was the one unqualified success of the entire Dardanelles adventure. Albert Jacka left Gallipoli as a hero. His Victoria Cross had made him famous across Australia. His face appeared on recruiting posters. Songs were written about his exploits. A prominent Melbourne businessman named John Wren had promised £500 and a gold watch to the first Australian to earn the Victoria Cross, and Jacka collected both. But he did not want the fame. When Prime Minister Billy Hughes asked him to return to Australia to help with recruiting campaigns, Jacka refused. He would not leave his mates. He would not trade on his reputation while other men were still fighting. Instead, he stayed with the 14th Battalion as they reorganised in Egypt. He passed through officer training school with high marks and was commissioned as a second lieutenant in April 1916. The quiet timber worker from Wedderburn was now an officer in the Australian Imperial Force, and then, in June 1916, the battalion received its orders. They were going to France. The Western Front was a different kind of war. At Gallipoli, the Australians had faced Turkish soldiers, brave, determined, but limited in their artillery and industrial capacity. In France, they would face the German army, the most formidable military machine in the world. The scale of everything was larger. The guns were bigger. The bombardments were longer. The casualties were measured not in hundreds, but in thousands. The 14th Battalion arrived in France in early June and was sent to a quiet sector near Armentières to acclimatise. Even there, in what was considered a rest area, the reality of the Western Front quickly became apparent. German artillery could reach any point behind the lines. Snipers watched every movement. Raids and counter-raids claimed lives every night. Charles Bean, the official Australian war correspondent, was with the troops. He recorded their first impressions, the endless columns of wounded being carried to the rear, the thunder of artillery that never stopped, the landscape churned into a wasteland of mud and craters and barbed wire. The men who had survived Gallipoli thought they knew what war was. They were wrong. In late July, the 14th Battalion was transferred south to the Somme Valley, where the British had launched a massive offensive on 1st July. The attack was supposed to break through the German lines and end the stalemate of trench warfare. Instead, it had produced the bloodiest day in British military history. 57 470 casualties, including 19,240 dead, in a single day. By the time the Australians arrived, the offensive had stalled. The Germans had been pushed back in places, but the breakthrough had not come. Instead, the battle had devolved into a grinding attritional struggle for every ridge, every village, every few hundred metres of churned earth. The Australians were sent to Pozières. The village of Pozières sat atop a ridge overlooking the battlefield. Before the war, it had been a farming community. Stone houses, a church, a windmill on the high ground. Now it was a name on a map, a military objective, a place where men were fed into the furnace and consumed. The 1st Australian Division attacked Pozières on 23rd July 1916. After 3 days of savage fighting, they captured what remained of the village. But captured is perhaps too strong a word. There was nothing left to capture. The buildings had been pulverized by artillery. The streets were gone. The trenches themselves had been obliterated, forcing the Australians to shelter in shell craters and pray that the next round did not land on top of them. And then the German artillery began its real work. For the next 6 weeks, the Germans poured shells onto Pozières in concentrations that surpassed anything yet seen on the Western Front. The bombardment was not measured in hours, but in days. The Australians could not dig proper trenches because any trench they dug was destroyed within hours. They could not sleep because the shelling never stopped. They could not even identify their own positions. The only landmarks were the bodies of their dead comrades, still wearing their red and white shoulder patches. One Australian officer, Lieutenant John Rawes, wrote home in words that captured the horror. "We are lousy, stinking, ragged, unshaven, and sleepless. My tunic is rotten with other men's blood and partly splattered with a comrade's brains. Several of my friends are raving mad." Into this inferno, on the night of 6th of August 1916, came the 14th Battalion, and with them came Lieutenant Albert Jacka. The night of 6th of August 1916 was one that no survivor would ever forget. The 14th Battalion moved into the line at Pozières just as darkness fell, relieving the exhausted remnants of the units that had held the position before them. The trenches, if they could still be called trenches, were little more than shallow scrapes in the earth, connected by shell craters and the bodies of the dead. The men picked their way forward through the darkness, stumbling over debris, stepping around corpses that had not yet been buried. Lieutenant Albert Jacka led his platoon into position in a section of the line known as the Elbow, some 600 metres east of what had once been the village. They found shelter in an old German dugout, a concrete bunker deep underground, one of the few structures that had survived the relentless bombardment. And then the shelling began. All night, the German artillery hammered the Australian positions with a ferocity that veterans of Gallipoli had never experienced. The shells came in waves, each explosion throwing up fountains of earth and steel, each concussion shaking the walls of the dugout, each near miss promising that the next might be a direct hit. The men huddled in the darkness, some sleeping despite the noise, others staring at the ceiling and wondering if the next shell would bury them alive. By dawn, the bombardment lifted. For a few moments, there was silence, the eerie, unnatural silence that always preceded an infantry attack. And then, at 4:45 in the morning, the Germans came. Jacka had just completed a reconnaissance of the surface and returned to the dugout. His men were exhausted, dazed from the night's bombardment, some still asleep. They had no warning of what was about to happen. The first sign of danger was the sound of boots on the stairs. 2 German soldiers appeared at the entrance to the dugout. Before anyone could react, they rolled a grenade down the stairway. The explosion killed 2 Australians instantly and wounded several more. The concussion left the survivors stunned, ears ringing, struggling to understand what was happening. But Jacka was already moving. He fired his revolver up the stairway, then charged up the steps, scrambling over the bodies of his wounded mates. When he reached the surface, he saw the full scope of the disaster. German troops had swept over the Australian trenches. They were everywhere, between the dugout and the village of Pozières, rounding up prisoners, consolidating their gains. The line had been overrun. Jacka and his handful of survivors were now behind enemy lines. And there was something else, A party of about 40 Australian soldiers from the 48th Battalion was being marched away as prisoners, escorted by more than 100 German guards. They were heading toward the German rear, away from the fighting, away from any hope of rescue. Jacka counted his men. 7 were still able to fight, 7 Australians against more than 100 Germans. Any sensible officer would have stayed hidden. Any sensible officer would have waited for reinforcements, preserved his men, survived to fight another day. Albert Jacka was not a sensible officer. He lined up his 7 men along the back of the trench. He told them what they were going to do. They would wait until the German escort came close, and then they would attack. The Germans had no idea what was coming. When the prisoners were within 30 meters, Jacka gave the signal. He leapt from the trench and charged directly into the mass of German soldiers, his men right behind him. The surprise was total. Half the Germans threw down their weapons immediately, convinced they were facing a much larger force, but the rest opened fire. Every man in Jacka's platoon was hit. Jacka himself was shot multiple times. 3 bullets, perhaps 7. The accounts vary. 1 round passed clean through his body beneath his right shoulder. 2 more struck his head. Each time he was knocked down, he got back up. Each time he fell, he rose again. Seeing Jacka's charge, Sergeant C.H. Beck of the 48th Battalion rallied the prisoners. They turned on their captors, seizing rifles, fighting back. The orderly column dissolved into chaos. A brutal, hand-to-hand melee of rifles and bayonets and fists. Jacka saw 4 Germans in a shell hole, firing on the Australians and taking a deadly toll. He charged them alone. They shot him again. He kept coming. When he reached them, he killed all 4, 3 shot through the head, 1 bayoneted. The fighting ended as suddenly as it had begun. 50 Germans surrendered. The prisoners were freed. The line was retaken. But Albert Jacka did not celebrate the victory. He collapsed where he stood, bleeding from wounds that should have killed him. In the chaos of the aftermath, stretcher bearers passed him by. His mates, themselves wounded, were carried to the rear. Everyone assumed he was already dead. When he regained consciousness, he was alone on the battlefield, and so he did the only thing he knew how to do. He began to crawl. The mud of Pozières was thick with blood and debris, churned by shells into a landscape that no longer resembled anything human beings had made. Somewhere in that wasteland, Albert Jacka dragged himself forward, inch by agonizing inch, toward the sound of Australian voices. He had been shot at least 7 times. 1 bullet had passed clean through his torso. 2 head wounds had left him barely conscious. His uniform was soaked with blood, his own and that of the men he had killed. By every reasonable measure, he should have been dead, but Albert Jacka had never been a reasonable man. How long he crawled, no one knows for certain. The battlefield was chaos, the wounded crying out, the stretcher-bearers overwhelmed, the living too exhausted to count the dead. At some point, a party of stretcher-bearers found him, still moving, still breathing, still refusing to give up. They carried him to a casualty clearing station. The doctors who examined him did not expect him to survive the night. The wounds were too severe, the blood loss too great. They did what they could and prepared for the worst. But Jacka did not die. He was evacuated to England, to the 3rd London General Hospital, where surgeons worked to repair the damage. 1 wound was so severe that it required a plug to stop the bleeding. Both eyes needed operations. For weeks, he lay in a hospital bed, slowly healing, enduring the attention of visitors who wanted to meet Australia's most famous soldier. He hated every moment of it. When a journalist came seeking an interview, Jacka reportedly told a visitor to inform the reporter that he had died. The newspaper took the story at face value. On 8th September 1916, publications across Australia reported that Lieutenant Albert Jacka, Victoria Cross recipient, had succumbed to wounds received at Pozières. The report was retracted a few days later. Jacka was alive and profoundly annoyed at the fuss. On 29th September 1916, well enough to travel despite his wounds, Albert Jacka went to Windsor Castle. There, King George V personally presented him with the Victoria Cross he had earned at Gallipoli more than a year earlier. For his actions at Pozières, the charge against impossible odds, the rescue of 40 prisoners, the fight that Charles Bean would call the most dramatic and effective act of individual audacity in the history of the Australian Imperial Force, Jacka received the Military Cross. Many who witnessed the action believed this was a grave injustice. Bean himself argued that Jacka had earned a second Victoria Cross. Others believed he deserved 3. The men of the 14th Battalion, who called themselves Jacka's Mob, had no doubt about what their commander had done, but the official records told a smaller story. The medals reflected not just courage, but politics, personality, and the judgment of superior officers, whom Jacka had frequently antagonized with his blunt manner and his refusal to stay quiet when he disagreed. He did not let the slight slow him down. By November 1916, Jacka had returned to his battalion. At Bullecourt in April 1917, he led a daring night reconnaissance of the German wire, penetrating their defences and capturing 2 enemy soldiers single-handed. He received a bar to his military cross. At Messines and Polygon Wood, he led his company with tactical skill that surprised those who had dismissed him as merely brave. In July 1917, a sniper's bullet wounded him again. He returned to the front. In May 1918, during the German Spring Offensive, he was badly gassed at Villers-Bretonneux. A projectile passed through his trachea. His war was finally over. He sailed home in September 1919 aboard the HMAT Euripides. When the ship docked in Melbourne, a crowd of thousands was waiting. A convoy of 85 cars escorted him through streets lined with cheering onlookers. The newspapers called him the symbol of the spirit of the ANZACs. But the wounds never healed, not fully. Jacka started a business with 2 mates from the 14th Battalion. He married. He was elected to the St Kilda City Council and became mayor, fighting for the welfare of the unemployed during the Depression, often refusing to take his own salary while others suffered. But his body was failing. The gas, the bullets, the years of strain, they had taken a toll that could not be repaid. On 17th January 1932, 1 week after his 39th birthday, Albert Jacka died at Caulfield Military Hospital. Nearly 6,000 people filed past his coffin. More than 1,000 returned soldiers led his funeral procession. 8 Victoria Cross recipients served as pallbearers. He was buried with full military honours in St Kilda Cemetery. At his funeral, they called him Australia's greatest frontline soldier. Charles Bean wrote simply, "He said what he meant and meant what he said." Albert Jacka crawled out of the mud when everyone assumed he was dead. He kept crawling until someone found him, and then he got up and went back to war. That is the legend, and every word of it is true.